The next sort of altered state that we'll talk about is a near-death experience. And that's where you have this sense of leaving your body, traveling through a tunnel toward a light and other beings, reviewing life experiences, and then returning to the body. So people have these common experiences with near-death experiences that, they regularly talk about similar sorts of events, when they're describing the experiences. And some of the features then in relation to phenospace that this sort of experience results in are claim of vertical perception. So they claim that they are really seeing these tunnels and these lights and these other people, and rational thought, memory, emotions of peace and love. So in a near-death experience, they have feelings. They feel like they're rationally thinking. They remember particular people. They have a flash of their life experiences going through their minds, all as part of the kind of common experience of a near-death experience. And so one of the questions then with respect to our class is, how do we think about these near-death experiences? One option is to think about them in terms of dualism, that these sorts of experiences prove that there is a non-physical spirit that's leaving the body and actually traveling to heaven or hell. So as these experiences are common, it seems like they give you a sense that, in fact, this really does happen, and this is evidence of life after death. And this is generally how a lot of people interpret these kinds of experiences as evidence, and they have very profound life-changing experiences for the people who report these kind of experiences. But this isn't necessarily the right answer in terms of how we should interpret near-death experiences. The materialist also would argue that there is a way to interpret these experiences as physical brain state changes in near death can account for the kinds of hallucinations that people have. Widespread brain activation can account for hallucination of tunnels and lights. And when we talk about hallucinations, we'll talk about the sorts of form constants that give you tunnels and the kind of visual structures that give you a feeling of lights and that sort of thing. The temporal lobe stimulation accounts for the out-of-body sense and the life review, and we'll talk about that when we talk about out-of-body experiences with Blank and Metzinger, and look at the way in which you can stimulate the temporal lobe and create similar sorts of experiences. And then finally, the release of endorphins accounts for the emotional responses. So we know that when the brain is undergoing a traumatic experience, it produces these kinds of chemicals that give you lots of wonderful feelings, and that can account for the feelings of love and peace that people report during near-death experiences. So here are two different kinds of explanations for near-death experiences, both of which you can evaluate in terms of your thinking about what consciousness is, what a self is, and then how to interpret these kinds of experiences. The next kind of experience that we'll talk about is mystical experiences. The next kind of altered state that we'll talk about is mystical experiences. And these can be described as a sense of the universe, living, unified, and eternal, and involves the features of our phenospace, loss of time, control, and a sense of self, feeling of exhilaration and acceptance. So lots of people have described these sorts of mystical experiences with these common features in terms of their experiences. And again, ask yourself, how do mystical experiences relate to the various theories of consciousness that we've talked about? How can we think about them in relation to dualism, materialism, scientist materialist, or limitativist materialist? What are the sorts of explanations that we have with respect to these kinds of mystical experiences? James has talked about 4 different markers of mystical experiences: that they're ineffable, they can't be described, they're noetic, a person has an experience of knowledge or enlightenment as a result of a mystical experience, and they're transient. These experiences pass quickly. The recall fades quickly, and also they're passive. There's a loss of control in mystical experiences. So you can think about, these four kinds of markers of experiences, and connect those with the features of phenospace and how they relate in terms of thinking of this kind of experience. You can also think about mystical experiences in relation to the near-death experience and how those are connected, and think about the explanations there. Do they apply to mystical experiences? When do mystical experiences tend to occur? And what the explanations might be for mystical experiences. One of the things I'm going to recommend is that you do a meditation experiment. This is something that in the before times we would do in class, where I would play this meditative tape and you would meditate, you'd practice meditating in class. There are there are lots of kinds of meditation, but two kinds of ways of thinking about meditation that are particularly relevant to the kinds of things that we've been discussing in this class. One is the practice of emptying the mind, trying to have no contents in your mind at all. And that is relevant to theories of consciousness where there are contents of consciousness. So the higher order representation theory, there's some sensation and a higher order thought or perception about that sensation. If your mind is entirely empty, then you don't have any contents, so you wouldn't have higher order contents. Global workspace, things are integrated into a space. If that space is empty, then there would be no consciousness. So be thinking about the practice of emptying the mind. Is that sort of practice possible? Or is there always some sort of contents, even if that contents is a kind of experience of oneness? Is that still a kind of consciousness? Alternatively, you might think of meditative practices as a practice of focusing on a specific kind of content, like a word, an object, or the breath. So the second sort of meditation, sometimes that's called mindfulness meditation, you're not trying to empty the mind, you're actually focusing the mind on something. Maybe you're focusing on the contents of your mind as they pass, and just trying to let go of the contents that are coming by, so that you don't get obsessed by particular contents. One of the ideas with mindfulness meditation of that sort is that we tend to get obsessed with things and we can't let them go. And this sort of stepping back from your own experiences can help you become more calm about them and stop obsessing. Or you might focus on your breath. That's similar to the kind of meditation practice that I'm going to recommend that you practice with, where you focus on your breathing, and that kind of focus then allows you to focus on the present and stop thinking about the past and the future, because we tend to spend all of our time in this kind of reflective state of what am I going to do next, or what did I do in the past that was bad or good, and we have trouble just being conscious in the present. And so this second sort of practice focusing on what's present, focusing on a particular thing that's present, like your breath, will bring you to a kind of conscious state that doesn't have these reflective aspects to it. So I'll recommend that you practice this, and then after you do the practice, ask yourself, what was that experience like? Did my experience change according to the categories of phenospace? What sort of changes did I notice? And this can be something that can be part of your journal exercise if you choose this sort of practice. And then finally, with respect to all of these kinds of altered states, ask yourself these questions. How is consciousness involved in these altered states? Is dualism suggested by them? Or are there materialist explanations for these altered states? And then we'll talk more in later sections about what these altered states tell us about reality. reality exists beyond the physical world? Is that what's implied by these states? And what are the interpretations of reality under different conditions? So, how are you interpreting reality? What implications of reality are provided by these kinds of altered states? So, these are two kinds of things to think about as we go through the different altered states. And what do altered states tell us about consciousness? Our first question and our main question for this class.